Hi! Today is day 8 of the Great War, Flawed, Peace. The question for today is, how is it possible that every single nation lost the Great War? As bad as the war was for the losers, it was also terrible for the winners. So, overview of what we talked about so far. We started out with nationalism in Europe and alliances across borders, how nationalism led Russia and Serbia to be allies, how nationalism pulled apart empires. Then we talked about the Western Front and the stalemate that developed in the trenches, Germany versus France. Mud, mud, mud. Then we talked about the war we're moving worldwide to East Africa. We talked about the German colony in what is today Tanzania, the Askari soldiers, and all the war that happened there. Then we moved to the Eastern Front and the shortage of leadership and the supply shortage that hampered both Russia and Austria. And that led to the Gallipoli campaign, and that also led to blockades and U-boats. Germany versus Britain. Germany wanted to supply Russia, Britain wanted to supply Russia. Germany blocked that. So then Britain blockaded Germany. So then Germany used submarines to go under and around, which then eventually led the US to join the war. And then we talked about home front discontent, people on the home front who were not happy, and how propaganda in places like Germany changed people's minds about reality, but also how people at home in Russia were suffering increasingly. And then the last topic from the last class was the end of empires, how the Ottoman Empire fell apart, the Russian Empire fell apart, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire fell apart. So the question for today is, how is it possible there were no winners? Like, even the winners were kind of losers. The war brought destruction, it brought death, it brought disfigurement, dismemberment, depression, cynicism, and it was worldwide. It affected the people in the colonies, it affected the people across Europe, it affected soldiers and civilians. So the first question that we need to try to understand is, how did the German military almost win the war? With Russia out of the war, the Russian Empire fell apart. Russia started its own revolution. With Russia out, Germany was able to turn all of its troops, and instead of focusing on Russia and France, they were able to turn all their troops from the Russian front over to France. This led the German military to organize the Ludendorff Offensive, named after General Ludendorff. This last push was Germany doing one big last attempt to defeat France. There were 5 chunks to the Ludendorff Offensive that we don't need to go into the details of, but you can see on this map that there were 5 pieces, and they happened month after month. So like the first one was in March, and then the next one was in April, and then the next one was in June, July, August, etc. Sorry, June and July. There were 2. March, April, May, June, July. That's 5 months. There you go. Then the Germans also had some success because they came up with new organization for their military, new organization called stormtroopers. These were elite forces. Excuse me. These were elite forces, soldiers who were the best, the youngest, the healthiest, the smartest. Instead of doing mass attacks of the entire infantry, using small groups of stormtroops to sneak deep into enemy territory. These are small groups, specialized fighters, an unprecedented amount of combinations of light weapons. You can see in this picture here, these 3 guys have, a combination of weapons. They've got gas masks, they've got grenades, but they also have automatic, semi-automatic weapons, machine guns, rifles, pistols, like all of the different things they might need in a group to be very adaptable. This is working, but by the time they get basically back to where they had been in 1916, their gains start to slow down, and the British and the Americans are able to start pushing them back. Pretty much the problem is these elite troops are fragile. They're small numbers, and when they're killed off, there's no one left to back them up. The people that are left in the German lines, usually back here in the safe zone, are the oldest, the weakest, the least brave, the youngest, the least experienced, the injured. And so there's no one to back up these stormtroops. So the German military almost wins, but it's sort of too little too late. Side note, many troops like Adolf Hitler, who was in the German military at the time, felt like this Ludendorff offensive was the light at the end of the tunnel. They were going to win. So, like people like Hitler, who was depicted here recuperating in a hospital, they thought Germany was going to win. And they believed for 5 months that Germany was going to win the war. And then, when kind of by surprise Germany loses, these men are going to feel like they've been betrayed. Remember that for later. All right. This is question number 2. How did the US and the Allies eventually defeat Germany? Germany was winning. If the US had not been involved, Germany probably would have won. So the US sent troops to Europe, and a lot of the troops we sent were inexperienced, but they were excited. And we win basically because we aren't tired. The other troops, the other armies, the French, the British, the Germans, the Russians, everybody's been fighting this war for years and years and years, like 4 years. The US arrives, we're fresh, we're energetic. The US joins the war in 1917, the same year that Russia leaves the war. And the US basically forces everybody to stop fighting. Our troops were welcomed by the French people, especially. They loved the United States troops. The Americans were coming, and it was a good thing. Some groups of American soldiers were treated better in France than they were in the US. For example, the Harlem Hellfighters here on the left, an all African American unit from Harlem, hence the name. And they were treated exceptionally well by the French people, who were grateful for the assistance and thankful for the saving their lives. And these Harlem Hellfighters were awarded the Croix de Guerre, the highest award that the French military gives. When they returned to the US military didn't recognize them at all. They weren't even allowed to participate in parades for soldiers returning. So that's an issue for US history, though. This graph down here shows us the casualties in war, and it shows you that the US has by far the least casualties for all of the large population nations involved in the war. Russia's way up there at the 9 million mark, Germany and Austria at the 7 million-ish area, but France is up there at the 6 million mark. And so France and the French people were just really grateful for the US coming in and ending it. So what happens on November 11th at 11:11, or what happened on 11/11 at 11:11? The Armistice. What's an armistice? An armistice is like a ceasefire. It's everybody stop, put your weapons down. How do you end a worldwide war? Well, there's not going to be one decisive Waterloo battle. It's going to come down to negotiating. But how do we stop the fighting? So representatives from France, Germany, etc., got together and negotiated on November 11th at 11:11 in the morning. We are going to stop fighting. Everyone is going to stop shooting. Everyone's going to put their guns on the ground. Everyone's going to stop. Just stop. Walk away. And then we can negotiate who wins, who loses, who gets what, etc. The troops were super excited about this. Everyone was super excited about this because everyone was very tired of the war. Last question for today. What did French people want from the Treaty of Versailles, and why? We had the armistice, the fighting stopped. Then we have to get together and negotiate what is gonna happen next. Representatives from over 30 countries got together to negotiate in Versailles at that palace. Remember the palace where Louis and Marie Antoinette used to live back before the French Revolution? That palace is where they had the treaty negotiations, and representatives from over 30 countries came to talk about what do we do now. The French people especially wanted revenge from this treaty. The French people felt like Germany had unfairly destroyed their country. France felt victimized because most of the war, at least on the Western Front, was fought inside France. You can see on this map here on the left, food shortages in 1918. Those serious food shortages we talked about in Germany, we didn't talk about them happening in France, but they were happening in France. France was just as hard up for food as Germany was. Also, this map here shows us the zones of destruction of the land. This key is sort of made larger and translated here, but you can see the zone where the war was fought, and you can see here's Paris for reference. This takes up sort of this upper, almost quarter of the land of France, and of this land, most of it is either has some destruction or a lot of destruction. This farmland, these cities completely destroyed by the war. So France says, look, we win. We won. You lost. Germany, you owe us. So the French people had their terms. They wanted Germany to pay for the damage to civilians from the land, from the sea, in the air, and they wanted Germany to pay them reparations. They wanted Germany to pay a lot of money so that France could rebuild its country. What did the French people want from the Treaty of Versailles? They wanted revenge. They wanted money, they wanted land, and they wanted payback. Why did they want this? They felt like, look, Germany suffered during the war, but the war didn't happen in Germany. It happened in France. So not only did we suffer the same amount on the home front as you guys, but literally our homes were gone. That's the end of that for today. Submit your 3 answers, or 4 answers, typo, and then write a paragraph to tie all this together. How is it possible that everybody lost? Even the winners, France, Britain, they're going to lose. And here's a map of the casualties by percentage of population to kind of give you a sense of how much each side lost. And then the Ottoman Empire is in very dark black, mostly because of the Armenian genocide. So kind of remember that.